G'day and welcome to the Hope25 podcast. I'm one of your hosts today, Michael. We've also got Christy with us for the first time where we're doing it together. How fun.
I know. I think it's the first time since our very first podcast, Michael, that we've actually managed to be in the same, recording room, if not actual room, to do this together. So that's great. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, totally. It's been so encouraging to hear some of the podcasts and would love to hear feedback as well, whoever's listening. And we're keen to get some more interviews. Today, we've got someone fantastic joining us, Cathy Ross. Cathy, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here. Do you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself and what you get up to?
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Christy. Really good to be here. So I live in Oxford, on the other side of the world from you guys, but I'm originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand, a Kiwi, as your listeners may be able to tell. Born and bred in Auckland. Studied French and German at Auckland Uni. Went off to be a mission partner with New Zealand CMS, mainly in Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, but also had some time in Rwanda and Uganda. Then taught at the Bible College of New Zealand, now Laidlaw College, and in 2005 moved to Oxford to work with CMS in the UK, where I still am working with CMS in Oxford.
And it sounds like you've had a few Aussies come through there as well. That's exciting. We were just saying before we started recording that there are some people that we know in common from different places, as there always seem to be in the church, which is kind of nice.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, Cathy, thanks so much for coming in and chatting with us. When we polled some different people about who would you like to hear from on the podcast, your name came up. So that's how we've been chasing you down, and I'm glad we've managed to catch you.
Thank you.
I often use your books when I'm teaching missiology, so it's kind of a bit of a fan moment for me as well. I'm really excited. But one of the things that I wanted to think about and focus on as we think about mission and about Hope25 today was thinking about hospitality. So you've co-authored a book called Mission on the Road to Emmaus, and you have this chapter on hospitality where you talk a little bit about how you tend to think about the church as a household and a household of God. And I thought that was really interesting because you talk about the way that households are places of welcome and hospitality, or at least we kind of hope they'll be places of welcome and hospitality, don't we? And I was just wondering, can you tell us a little bit about that and that thought process?
Okay, yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I think I actually stole that phrase from Pope Francis, but anyway, there's nothing new under the sun, is there? I guess I got into thinking, I'll come to that in a moment, the household image. I got into thinking about hospitality, I guess, because of all the different places that we've lived. So we come from New Zealand, and then we've had time in East Africa. We did some training in England at All Nation Christians College before we went to Belgium for a year, where my husband did tropical medicine, and then we went to Congo. So we've lived in lots of different countries and experienced and seen hospitality expressed in lots of different ways. So that has been really enlightening and challenging. So, for example, when we're in Uganda, and I imagine it's like this in a lot of East Africa. I mean, if not all over Africa, in the majority world, in fact. You know, we tend to kind of invite people over for coffee or for dinner or whatever, but there you just drop in on people. You don't make some formal arrangement, you know, you just drop in and there's always enough. There is, and of course you get the best, and there's always enough and more because people expect that, they're very generous and they share. So I guess it just got me thinking about how hospitality functions as expressed and what it means to engage in hospitality. And of course,
yeah, that's really interesting because it is so different, isn't it, the way that we do hospitality. And I sometimes think my grandmother's generation a bit like that. You just drop in.
Yeah.
I don't love when people just drop into my house, I've got to say. It's like the doorbell rings and you're thinking, who is that? Last night the doorbell rang, my dog went crazy. I told him off, and then it turns out there was a police officer at the door looking for some questions on something that happened locally. And I was like, there's a person at my door. So it is really interesting the difference between, like, the difference that culture makes in how we think about hospitality and what that looks like.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Because basically, the Western world, I think, is an aberration in terms of how we view ourselves, because we're just very individualistic. And the rest of the world is very communitarian. And I don't know if you've come across the concept of Ubuntu. Desmond Tutu made it very popular. Now, I am because we are. So I can't exist without you, Christy. I can't exist without you, Michael. I can't exist as an island, one person by myself. It's all about community. And we can only exist in community, which is a deeply Christian worldview. So, they say an Englishman's home is, we have this idea that, we're in our home and we don't want to be interrupted, and we have our timetables. And the rest,
we pull up the moat as soon as we can.
Yeah. And the rest of the world is just so much more relationship oriented. And so I learned a lot about that living outside the West and initially outside Aotearoa, New Zealand. England is much more private, a very private culture. So you can imagine how immigrants to all the different Western countries must really suffer because they're not invited into people's homes. So I think
we have a family friend from South Sudan who we gave him a big cup of tea once when he came to visit us as a family. And apparently in South Sudan, if you give someone the big cup, it means drink this and go away. If you're being hospitable, you give them a small cup and you keep refilling it. So he was like, he kind of looked at us strangely. We're like, do you not like your tea? And it was really interesting to think about that cultural thing of just hanging around with each other and the different signals we see.
Well, I think there is so much in this because firstly, home, back to your question about the church as the household of God and home. And then I just want to say something about, I guess, power dynamics and resources. So home, one would hope, is a safe, welcoming place. In fact, home is the least safe place for many women in our world, as we know. So it's not an uncomplicated metaphor. And often the church is not a safe place for all sorts of people, in fact, sadly. So it isn't an uncontested metaphor. You hope that home would be a place of welcome, of safety, of hospitality, and that's what you'd hope the church might be. But I think we do need to realise that it's not uncomplicated. And also I think there are power dynamics. And so often in church, we are the people basically wanting to make others like us. So we invite them into our space and we say, oh, come and, we're the beneficent, receive our hospitality. Maybe sometimes we need to flip that and actually we need to receive the hospitality and we need to go out and listen and learn and see how we can receive and maybe also offer hospitality in other spaces. Because I think so often the church has felt like we are the default setting. I think the CFE is very much like this. We are the Church of England. Church of England sees itself as the state church. It's the only show on the road. Come to us because we know best. And that really is not hospitality. And there's definitely a power dynamics in that. And so often we are the ones that are doing all the offering and expecting others to do all the receiving. And that's, I don't think, a particularly Christian perspective. So that's something else that I learnt living overseas.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
Oh, and the other point
how those experiences shape us.
Sorry, it was about resources, because I went to wrote an article once about women on mission, and we workshopped it with women from all over the world. And it was just very humbling to kind of realise that, it's fine to talk about hospitality and, people, these were people, the woman I remember actually was from Ethiopia, I think. But several of them said this, in our cultures, people come all the time, they drop in, and of course the women normally are expected to produce food and provide the hospitality. And that can be, it can be very stretching and very demanding. And they're already have very minimal resources, and they're expected to provide more. And of course the guest always gets the best. And it looks great from the outside when you're the guest, but actually it can be extremely demanding. So hospitality can sound like this lovely fluffy thing, but actually it can be pretty demanding and very stretching for those who already have few resources.
I think particularly in Western culture, well, here in Australia anyway, we can misalign hospitality and think that it's entertaining. As opposed to, actual hospitality.
Yeah, although I do think food and drink is pretty important.
Yes.
I think that might have been one of the questions you wanted to talk about later, but I was very struck once when I read one of my favourite theologians, who's called Emmanuel Katongole. I don't know if you've come across him. He's a Roman Catholic Ugandan theologian. He's written amazing books, Born from Lament, The Sacrifice of Africa, and his latest one is Who Are My People? It's about identity. He actually teaches at Notre Dame in the States. And he made this point about Jews and Gentiles eating together. That's, it's breaking down the walls that divide when they can eat together. And I think in many ways eating together breaks down lots of barriers. I remember one of our tutors at All Nations Christian College, and we studied there. They had us round for dinner, and they gave us spaghetti bolognese. And she said, "Oh, we always give visitors spaghetti bolognese because it's hard to be on your high horse when you're eating spaghetti bolognese." Oh, yeah, that's a good point. You share stories when you're eating and you relax, and I think food and drink is actually, I know what you mean, Michael, that it's sort of, we turned it into this whole industry, but I think eating together, it doesn't have to be fancy food, it can be a picnic, it can be
exactly,
cake or whatever. I think eating together really does kind of relax us and just does break down some boundaries. We all have to eat. We have that in common.
Yeah.
Yeah. No matter how important we think we are, we have to eat.
Yeah, exactly.
We've all got to eat. Yeah. Yeah, that's really nice. And hospitality is something that really does just bring us together to think about it. And one of the things that you've written about is the idea of hospitality as kind of a prophetic dialogue, which I think is a really interesting idea. And I'm interested in how you see that idea of hospitality as prophetic dialogue play itself out.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, prophetic dialogue is actually a phrase from Stephen Bevins. He's an American missiologist whom I really rate, another Roman Catholic. And he's Society of the Divine Word, SVD. And I think prophetic dialogue is one of their little mantras. And as I understand it, it came out from two kind of wings or two groups of people within the SVD. So the prophetic side was very much from those from Latin America and the liberation theology kind of perspective. And the dialogue side came very much from those in Asia who are very much into interfaith dialogue and conversation and conversing with one another. So they put the two together, which is, and Steve Bevins says that he thinks of it as a kind of spirituality. So I think that's a nice way to think about it. Prophetic dialogue is a sort of spirituality. And it also, I think, implies listening, which I think is a really important part of mission and hospitality. I read this wonderful phrase last week by Mary Oliver, who's one of my favourite poets, and she said, "Attention is the beginning of devotion." I love that. So just being attentive and listening, I think, is a really important part of hospitality. And in some ways that is prophetic. And I link the prophetic with subversive, because I think hospitality can be subversive because it points to a different way. It points to a different kind of life. Christine Pohl, who writes on hospitality, her book, which the title has gone out completely out of my head. Can you remember it, Christine?
I can't, but we can look at it and put it in the show notes.
It's kind of the magnum opus on hospitality. It'll be in my book somewhere. Creating space, making room, recovery of hospitality as a Christian tradition. I got there in the end. She says that she thinks the church has practiced hospitality most effectively when the church has been marginalised and been on the edge. And basically, whether we like it or not, we're in that situation today in the West. The church is definitely, who cares about the church? It's definitely, even if it doesn't think it is marginalised and on the edge. And I think in a way, showing hospitality just points to a richer, deeper possibility of life. So I think that's what I mean about it being subversive. And also, this is another thing about eating together. Emmanuel Katongole says that eating together is a political act. And I also like that because with whom do we eat? Who do we eat with? I mean, that's what Jesus says. Are you just going to have a dinner party with all those, that are going to invite you back? Or are you, who are we out on the streets hanging out with? With whom are we experiencing or sharing hospitality? So it's easy just to have our, white middle-class dinner parties. But how prophetic or subversive are we actually trying to be? I think that's pretty challenging. It's easy to say.
Yeah, are we pulling people down from trees and saying, I'm going to have dinner at your place tonight?
Yeah, a lot harder to do.
Yeah.
But, small steps. There are different ways, aren't there? Different ways of being hospitable. I mean, how often do we walk past it? In Britain, there's homeless people sell a magazine on the streets, and how often do we just walk past them and don't even look them in the eye or greet them? There's lots of small steps, aren't there? I mean, Christine Pohl says, I also love this too, she says something like, just looking another person in the eye, which I realise in certain cultures is not, like in Polynesian culture, you don't do that to an older person, but the point, in a Western culture, looking someone in the eye just acknowledges their existence and can be affirm them and give them dignity. You just walk past this person and ignore them, minimising and degrading. just to at least stop and greet them is an act of hospitality.
John Macquarie in some of his work talks about the idea that courtesy is how we show other people that we see their humanness.
Exactly,
and
that we see them. And John Taylor, who was a General Secretary of CMS and a missionary in Uganda, he talks about the gift of sight and insight. I love that. And he says it's a gift of the Holy Spirit to really see another person.
I think, anyway, this could be a tangent and we could edit this out, but at least in Australia, we see a lot of things being automated. So, people ordering their shopping to their front door without having to interact with someone, or ordering food off a screen at a restaurant at McDonald's anyway, so you don't need to interact with people. A lot of our systems are designed for efficiency and not for hospitality, but the kingdom is completely different than that.
Yeah, I completely agree, and it's certainly since COVID, isn't it, for various reasons. But I mean, again, all that depends on having access. A lot of that depends on having access to good internet, and that also depends on having a certain income and living in a certain place and all the rest of it. So, yeah, I feel that isn't very hospitable. You're right. Yeah, trying to actually phone up someone and talk to a human being on a phone in a service industry is increasingly difficult. Yeah.
A bunch of millennials just crawled up and shriveled into a ball thinking about calling someone there. Kathy.
Sorry.
I say to my students when they're not returning my emails, if I haven't heard from you, I will give you a call. And all of the older students go, oh, that's great, she's going to call me. And all of the younger ones immediately reply to my emails. It's amazing.
I should try that.
So, Kathy, sometimes as churches we may think that we're really hospitable, but we may not be seeing those people, or we might not be able to see people coming in or flocking in. What do you think hospitality might look like in our parishes, in our churches? Are there any ways to tell if we actually are a hospitable parish?
Yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts about that. So Christine Pohl says, if your church is messy, if things are messy, you're probably doing it right.
I like that.
So, and of course, there's no model for, one model for hospitality. I mean, we say at CMS, context is everything. Well, nearly everything. So, every church is in a different context and it's going to look different and be worked out differently. But I'm sorry to slightly deconstruct the question, but it kind of depends on what you mean by church. And I don't know. I kind of grew up, I think, with church meaning and hospitality meaning you come to the service on Sunday morning and then you have, as one friend called it, a cup of horrible tea or coffee and an evangelical biscuit after church. Do you have Crispies in Australia? Crispy biscuits? These ghastly, dry, sort of coconut-flavoured biscuits? Oh my God.
I don't think we do. We used to talk about church cordial though, which is when they add cordial. The least amount of cordial you possibly can and top it up with water.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Well, that is definitely not hospitality. At least get decent coffee.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's like the lowest common denominator. It also means that we expect people to come to us. And it's kind of like, Sam Wells talks about doing for and being with. And doing for is like, sometimes that's appropriate, but it is sort of at its lowest common denominator, do-goodism. Being with is just being alongside. He says with is the most important word in theology. So being alongside, being with, listening and learning. So what does that look like for a parish church? I think those are pretty challenging questions because in some ways I don't think parish churches are really set up to practice hospitality in a way that might work in the current context. So I think people just have to try lots of different things. And I think it also means probably asking people in the parish and in the community, what might it look like? What voices are missing? Who are we not listening to? How could we offer and receive hospitality in a way that makes sense in this community? And I just think that we don't ask enough questions. We think we have the answers. We think we know what people want, but maybe we actually don't. And maybe we have something to learn. And maybe it actually means just getting out into the community and doing really different things. I don't know, instead of having a service on Sunday, go pick up all the rubbish. Or go and work, volunteer in the library, or I don't know. I mean, all those are, I think, ideas of what hospitality could be. You know, it isn't just inviting everyone to church and having a big picnic. I mean, it could be that.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot more to it.
So maybe the question to ask is not how can our parish be more hospitable, or how can our church be more hospitable, but also how can those of us in our church be hospitable? How can our families and our small groups and all of us think about being hospitable in our own contexts as Christians?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've been interested in some research that we've done with people in different small missional communities, and some of those people are not Christians, how much people want to pray. If you offer to pray with people, they love it. I mean, that's an act of hospitality, I think. But we don't. I was actually slightly humbled and ashamed to think, oh my gosh, why am I surprised? Why am I surprised that people want to pray? Probably because I've never asked them. And yet people are mostly pretty open to that, surprisingly. When you have a relationship, I mean, I wouldn't boil up to someone on the street and say, do you want to pray? Although I suppose you could, but I probably wouldn't.
Oh, yeah, look, I've seen people do that, and often the answer is, like, actually, like, there is something you can pray for me for. What have I got to lose? Like, why not try prayer? I tried everything else.
Well, at the moment in Bathurst, there's a Winterfest. There's a community Winterfest happening with ice skating and everything like that. And the cathedral has a stand there, which also includes a prayer tent. And if anybody wants prayer, it's just there. They're not approaching people, but people are coming to them, and that's their act of hospitality into their community. And there's more that they're doing.
Exactly,
But that's just one aspect of it.
I mean, CMS used to have people in mind, body, spirit fairs with those tents using a Jesus deck and those, decks of cards, and instead of tarot cards, it was praying blessings on people. So it's just different ways of actually meeting people where they're at and finding out what their passions and interests are and engaging with that. I mean, that is a deeply hospitable act, isn't it? So it's not making them like us, it's meeting people where they're at and finding out what their interests are and how to connect with them in an appropriate way. I mean, that's what mission's all about, basically, isn't it? But hospitality, I think, is a really rich kind of idea and theme to mine for all these different aspects.
So in recent years, and even before COVID, we in Australia have seen more and more people experience loneliness, and often people don't want to admit that they're lonely because of a bit of shame and stigma around it. What role do you think might missional hospitality play in engaging people and welcoming them into our church communities, Cathy?
Yeah, well, loneliness is a huge issue in the West. In Britain, they appointed several years ago a minister of loneliness. Oh, it sounds like something out of Harry Potter. A minister for loneliness. And there's been all sorts of research and statistics. I can't remember them all now exactly, but loneliness costs the NHS, the health system in the UK, millions of pounds. They reckon that, being lonely is the equivalent of, I don't know, smoking 10 cigarettes a day or something. It's really bad for your health. So, it's a huge issue in the UK. And it is partly because, as I said before, we're very individualistic and we live in our little castles and fortresses, and we're not very good at creating community. So you would hope that the church would model something different of what it means to be an intergenerational, all-age community with all its, challenges and difficulties, but that ultimately can love one another. And that's what you would hope that, Leslie Newbigin talks about, doesn't he? The church being the hermeneutic of the gospel, that it would be a place that people would want to be a part of. But I just think so often it isn't, because we're not very attractive and we fuss about all the wrong things. I mean, I actually really like, as this may put off some of your listeners and some of the other listeners may love it, I think the Rob Bell phrase, love wins, just says it all. Love wins. Why is it so difficult to be a community of love? So often we're seeing as communities that say, don't do this, don't do that. I just think Jesus was on the edges. He loved people on the margins. He healed people. He removed their shame. He restored their dignity. He welcomed and included everybody. And I think we can worry about sin later. I'm not saying that isn't sin, that's pretty obvious in our world today, but let's love people first and then sort out the rest. And I think that is about hospitality. And I think it is about more about going out than getting people to come in and just connecting with people where they're at. It's friendship, relationships, long-term stuff. Courses just don't cut it for me. It's relationship, it's friendship, it's genuine listening and interest. And if people, everyone is carrying something, everybody has a need. And it's showing that actually Jesus will meet that need, but not in some, cliched, simplistic sort of way, because people are complex. I don't know, does that answer your question? I don't know if that answers the question about loneliness. Well, it sort of answers about loneliness, because it's just people.
It does, yeah.
I think it does.
And also showing, we're not perfect people. And I think people know that. We're clearly not perfect people.
People know that. Whether we know it is, I think, a whole other thing.
Yeah.
There was a church that one of my friends led in Adelaide when I lived there. It wasn't an Anglican church, but that's okay. We might be able to still learn things from them. And they started a community meal. And one of the things that they found was they kind of expected people, from lower socioeconomic kind of places might come to the community meal. Here's a meal. We're going to eat together. We've got these things. But they also found all of these young professionals who lived alone started coming to the community meal, and everybody mixing in together because, as a young professional who lives alone, if I can still be called young, sometimes you would like to eat with other people and you don't want to have to call people up and go, would you want to do this tonight? And having something like that can actually bring, the diversity in amongst the people that it brought together in that meal was just really beautiful to see. All of those people working together and sitting and eating their spaghetti bolognese or whatever it was.
That's a great example. And let me just give you two quick examples of what two of our former students have done, which is, I think, examples of hospitality. It's not parish church. It's something very different. So one guy was a classic car enthusiast before he trained to be an Anglican minister. And he just decided to use that passion to create a small missional community, which he has called Revs Limited. You can look it up. And he got initially, guys who are interested in classic cars, then families come along. It's all built around an interest in classic cars, but he is very good at being bilingual, and so he will say to them, as you love and care for your classic car and, restore it and work on it. So that's what God does with us. He loves and cares for us and wants to restore us. And he talks about rust as sin, and he gets into post little prayer requests through the sunroof of his old Rover. And, and this community has grown because then COVID came along and it went online, and it's now there's several of them meeting around the country. But it's got like 5,000 members. And most of those people are not Christians, but they love coming together. That was the initial shared interest. Now they come together and they pray, and people have come to Christ. Another guy who's from a pretty tough background, long story short, he founded a boxing church on a tough housing estate. His friend said to him, wouldn't it be great if we could, have box? And so they got together a boxing club in the local community, and these guys are all boxers, their families come along. They say this is like a boxing club we've never experienced before. People care for you, they're friendly, they're welcoming, they pray for you. So those are, it's kind of having some creativity and imagination to see what might be possible. So I think those, you could call them homogeneous units if you like, because they're based around a particular interest, but lots of different people end up coming and it kind of flows outward. And I think those are examples of hospitality, just some creative, imaginative, different sort of ideas.
I love that, because I think often we're people in our churches, we can be so busy with all of the church stuff that we realize that, our only links to community are other people in the church. I was in the state emergency service here for a while, which does sort of storm cleanups and trees on roofs and things like that. It was great when I was working as a youth and young adults pastor, because the ministry never ends. But if I go and chop a tree off a roof, that's done. I've done a job. I can tick it off. I've done a good thing, which was very, very good. But I found I was in a unit with like 70 people and there was only one other Christian there. And I was talking with some of my Christian friends, like, this is a great thing to do. It's, we're serving the community. We're doing these things. And they'd just be like, I'm so busy with all of these different things that I'm doing at church. And they're all really great things. They're all really good things to be doing. But we're not actually able to get out of our little bubbles sometimes and to think about hospitality beyond that church bubble.
We may need to rethink the model.
Well, that is a challenging prospect, but it might be a good challenge to leave us on as we think about how we do hospitality as people who are Christians and as people who love Jesus with the people around us. Thank you so much, Cathy, for joining us. I encourage you to have a look at some of Cathy's work. She's got lots of really helpful stuff in the area of mission. And please do think about writing to us. You can write to us if you've got ideas for the podcast, things that you'd like to hear, things that would be helpful for you and for your community. You can contact us at podcast@hope25.com.au. And Michael and I'm sure, would love to read your emails and have a look at them. So thank you very much. Don't forget to check out the website and keep thinking and keep hoping as we think about Hope 25 for next year. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cathy.